So, my friends, for the last several weeks, I've been talking about what's called the four immeasurables or four virtues in Buddhist psychology. We started off with love or loving kindness, which is about wishing happiness to self and others. And then we transitioned to compassion and self-compassion, which is about identifying suffering with an intention to relieve that suffering. And then after that, we explored joy last week, actually, which is about resonating with the happiness of other people and also bringing joy into our own hearts by connecting with the energy of life without the filter of the conditions, the stories that often obscure our capacity for joy. And so this week I want to talk about equanimity. I find it a bit synchronistic in the sense of, it seems like since we last got together, the culture, and I won't go on and on about this, but there's so many passions arising, understandably, in the culture around racial injustice, on top of our global pandemic and so many other divides. And that, of course, is not the focus of our meeting. But I find that perhaps more than ever in the recent decades, we are in great need of not only love, compassion, and joy, but also equanimity. And so I'd like to start off with a story I often tell on retreat. Perhaps some of you who have joined us on retreat have heard this story. But it came to me this morning, and I want to share it with you. It's a story about a samurai warrior in ancient Japan who, after 40 years of being in battle as a warrior, decided to put his sword down and explore philosophy, spirituality, and meditation. And so he decided to seek out the wisest person in his village. And he found an old Zen master who was reputed for his great wisdom, his insights, and a wonderful heart of compassion. And so the samurai warrior presented himself to the Zen master, and he asked the Zen master a question. After, of course, the Zen master asked him, "Why are you here?" The samurai replied, "I would like to understand the difference between heaven and hell. I would like to understand the difference between heaven and hell." Hearing that question, the Zen master immediately launched into telling that samurai that you could never understand the difference between heaven and hell because you are an ignorant, stupid, hopeless imbecile. Upon hearing that insight, the samurai reached for his sword, and he was just about to chop the neck of the Zen master when the Zen master pointed to him and said, "That is hell." At that time, hearing that proclamation, the samurai shed a tear that trickled down his face. He softened. And the Zen master said, "And that is heaven." So just take that in. And perhaps connect with that in a way that makes personal sense to you. It does, of course, have great applicability to equanimity. Equanimity is about an evenness of the mind in the face of changing conditions. With regard to anger, and that story, of course, for the therapists and others amongst us who have done their personal work, we all know at least an intellectual level, that it's not the things that happen to us that make us angry, but rather the internal conditions that meet the external that make us angry. And I'm not denying the usefulness of anger, because sometimes anger, of course, can help us create a very necessary boundary and certainly has evolutionary value. But I'm talking about the kind of anger that is our normal everyday anger, whereby something happens or someone says something that we don't like and we react in anger. We have many opportunities for that, of course. And so it's our attachment to wanting, in those situations, our attachment to wanting things to be or people to be a certain way that activates the heat of anger. Now, the American Buddhist Bhikkhu Bodhi says that, and I quote, that equanimity is evenness of mind, unshakable freedom of mind, a state of inner equipoise that cannot be upset by gain and loss, honor and dishonor, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. Freedom from all points of self-reference. It is indifference only to the demands of the ego's self, with its craving for pleasure and position, not to the well-being of one's fellow human beings. So just take that in. So this unshakable freedom of mind, and certainly it sounds very lofty when I read that kind of definition from someone who's probably meditated for 40 or 50 years. However, it's a guidepost, of course, that we can follow. And drawing upon our discussions in the past around loving kindness and joy and compassion, we see that equanimity is not separate from them. It is informed by those qualities of the heart-mind, if you will. And when we practice mindfulness, we cultivate those qualities when we're really paying attention and with intention to align our thoughts, speech, and actions with those virtues. Equanimity often naturally arises. In the culture of mindfulness and Buddhist psychology, equanimity is sometimes seen as the flowering of the practice, especially around practicing loving kindness, compassion, and joy, and also a thread that connects the others to it. And there are several ways that we can, well, let me just go back and say that the near enemy, as I mentioned, of equanimity is indifference. So we're not talking about this stony, untouchable inner experience, but rather being even-mindedness, even in the face of our reactivity, if that makes sense. Or at least encountering the aftermath of our reactivity and anger with a sense of equanimity. And the far enemy of equanimity is thought to be resentment and attachment. I think attachment is a good general word for what gets in the way of our equanimity, because often we're attached when we're angry. To use anger as an example, it might not be anger. We're attached to getting things the way we want them to be, or not getting what we don't want, for example. And this has, of course, great applicability to our close relationships. And so being aware that we are such conditioned beings, if we don't, for example, receive a certain kind of praise that we expect, that's another example of an attachment. I was reading the massive tome by Joseph Goldstein, a very prominent Buddhist teacher. The book is entitled Mindfulness. And what he says is that he was reading Amazon reviews after one of his books was published. And there were many wonderful comments praising his work. He read one negative comment and it took him right down. And I think so many of us can relate to that sort of attachment. That seems to be how our minds are socio-biologically wired. And yet, if we are practitioners, we can not only cultivate equanimity by letting go of our attachments, or at least letting them be and not relating and thinking from the place of our attachments. And we can also guard against giving into our attachments. Giving into our attachments. That's why the classic teachings say something to the effect of be even-minded, even not just in the face of blame, also in the face of praise. Because being extremely elated around being praised, of course, is just the shadow side of feeling disempowered or deflated in the face of blame. So a few ways that we can develop and strengthen our equanimity. One is to remember that it's all impermanent. If we're angry or worried in this moment, that won't last forever. I know it's easier said than done. And also guarding, as I mentioned earlier, guarding against getting swept up into our reactions. There's a wonderful story about the two arrows. You know, the first arrow is anything that's slung towards our heart that hurts us in the form of blame or anger or reactivity or something we don't like, or someone says something we don't like. That's the first arrow. The second arrow is our self-judgment. We inflict more pain. And so the process is about guarding against, especially that second arrow. We can't help control the first arrow. We can't help control what happens usually. But we can certainly guard against that second arrow of judgment and a story that perpetuates the idea of our unworthiness or whatever that may be, or that fuels the fire of our anger. So this is not a passive process. I mentioned letting go of attachment. I learned recently that the Dalai Lama, when he first meets a new person in his life, he treats them as if they are an old friend. So imagine that. Imagine that. Or someone that is very challenging to you. Treat them as an old, dear friend, if you're willing. If you're willing. Another way to practice or cultivate equanimity is to hang out with people who are equanimous. A lot of you have heard of the idea of emotional resonance. If you ever want to feel down and negative and pessimistic, just hang out with some really negative, pessimistic people. Of course, you know that. And the opposite is true. When you're around buoyant people who are embodying joy, there's a tendency for emotional resonance to occur unconsciously. And when we associate with people who have developed their equanimity, we seem to experience that as well. All you have to do technologically these days is go onto YouTube and hear someone like the Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh give a talk on anger, compassion, or any subject, and you'll probably feel the resonance of his serenity. And so another code word, several code words for equanimity, which might make more sense to us, are a sense of balance, peace, and even temperedness. Balance and peace seems to make great sense. And then one other way, of course, that we can develop equanimity, pardon me, is by developing concentration through the process of meditation. To the degree we are able to develop deep concentration, equanimity can flow. Of course, the challenge is always when we get off of the meditation cushion or chair and we encounter life and other people that inhabit that life. That is the challenge. And that's why often, of course, meditation is not enough.